The server room hummed with the quiet intensity of machines that never sleep. At 4:47 a.m., while the rest of Datacore Systems remained dark and empty, a single workstation glowed in the corner of the basement level. Margaret Chun's fingers moved across 3 keyboards simultaneously, her eyes tracking lines of code that cascaded down multiple monitors like digital waterfalls. She had been here for 6 hours straight, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had seen something in the system logs that didn't belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A pattern. Subtle, almost invisible, but there. Hidden beneath layers of routine network traffic was a signature that made her pulse quicken. Someone was testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses with the patience of a master craftsman. The attempts were so sophisticated that the automated security systems hadn't even flagged them as suspicious. But Margaret had learned to read between the lines of code the way others read facial expressions. She pulled up the raw packet data from the past 72 hours, her weathered hand steady despite the caffeine tremor that had become her constant companion. The timestamps told a story. The intrusion attempts came in waves, each one slightly different from the last, like a pianist practicing scales in different keys. Whoever was doing this wasn't some amateur script kiddie. This was someone who understood systems architecture. At a fundamental level, Margaret's reflection caught in the darkened window beside her workstation. At 45, she had the kind of face that people glanced past in meetings without really seeing. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes were chosen for comfort rather than style. She had long ago stopped trying to compete with the younger developers who filled the open-plan workspace upstairs. Their standing desks and energy drinks, a constant reminder that the industry had moved on without her. But down here, in the quiet sanctuary of the server room, age meant something different. It meant experience. It meant having lived through enough system failures to recognize the warning signs that others missed. It meant understanding that the most dangerous threats weren't the ones that announced themselves with sirens and flashing lights, but the ones that whispered through the network like ghosts. The Datacore building stretched 43 floors into the Seattle skyline, its gleaming facade reflecting the city's reputation as a hub of technological innovation. Inside, 5,000 employees worked on everything from cloud infrastructure to artificial intelligence, their combined efforts generating billions in revenue each quarter. The company's security division occupied the entire 32nd floor, a glass-walled fortress where the brightest minds in cybersecurity monitored threats from around the globe. Margaret worked 2 floors below them, in what everyone called the Legacy Systems Department. It was corporate speak for the place where older employees went to maintain the ancient code that kept the company's foundational systems running. The basement level housed the servers that had been humming since the company's early days, back when Datacore was just another startup with big dreams and questionable funding. She had been assigned to this department 3 years ago, after a restructuring that everyone understood was really about age discrimination wrapped in corporate politeness. The message was clear: make room for the younger talent, but keep the old guard around to maintain the systems they understood. It was a form of technological hospice care, keeping the legacy systems alive until they could be properly replaced. Most of her colleagues had taken early retirement packages or found positions at smaller companies, where their experience was still valued. Margaret had stayed, not because she loved the work, but because she had seen something in the company's architecture that others had missed. Datacore's entire security framework was built on the assumption that the legacy systems were isolated, irrelevant, and therefore safe to ignore. They were wrong. Margaret's workstation was a Frankenstein of old and new technology. 3 monitors of different sizes displayed streams of data, network diagrams, and code repositories. Her mechanical keyboard, a relic from the 1980s, clicked rhythmically as she typed. The sound had annoyed her younger colleagues when she still worked upstairs, but down here, it was just another part of the server room symphony. She had built this setup herself, piece by piece, over the past 3 years. The official IT department had provided her with a standard workstation, but Margaret had quietly assembled her own system, using spare parts and obsolete equipment that other departments had discarded. The older hardware actually had advantages for her work. It could run legacy software that modern systems couldn't handle, and its simplicity made it harder for malicious code to hide. Her desk was organized with the precision of someone who had learned to work efficiently in small spaces. Coffee cups from the past week stood in a neat row, each one marked with the date and time she had started drinking it. Her notebook lay open to a page covered in her careful handwriting. Network addresses and timestamps forming patterns that would have looked like random numbers to anyone else. The notebook had been a gift from her daughter Emily, who worked as a graphic designer in Portland. "Mom, you're the only programmer I know who still writes things down by hand," Emily had said, laughing as she handed over the leather-bound journal. Margaret had smiled and accepted the gift, but she hadn't explained that handwritten notes were harder to hack than digital files. Some habits from her early career in government security were hard to break. Margaret's background was a carefully kept secret at DataCore. Her official resume listed her previous job as senior developer at Federal Systems Integration, a generic title that could have meant anything. She had learned not to mention that she had spent 15 years working for the National Security Agency, where she had specialized in hunting the kind of sophisticated attackers that most corporate security teams only read about in threat intelligence reports. The transition from government to corporate work had been jarring. At NSA, she had been part of an elite team that tracked state-sponsored hackers and cyber-terrorism networks. Her colleagues had been seasoned professionals who measured their success in prevented disasters rather than quarterly earnings reports. When budget cuts and political reshuffling had eliminated her position, she had found herself adrift in a private sector that seemed to value youth and buzzwords over actual expertise. DataCore had hired her because her resume showed extensive experience with secure systems, but they had never asked about the specific nature of that experience. She had been placed in the Enterprise Security Division initially, where she had spent 6 months trying to convince her manager that their threat detection systems had significant blind spots. Her concerns had been dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of someone who couldn't adapt to modern security practices. The final straw had come during a team meeting where she had tried to explain why their network segmentation wasn't sufficient to contain a determined attacker. Her manager, a 30-something MBA with a certificate in cybersecurity, had interrupted her presentation to explain that legacy systems weren't a priority because nobody cares about old code anymore. The room had erupted in laughter, and Margaret had quietly gathered her materials and returned to her desk. 2 weeks later, she was transferred to the Legacy Systems Department. The move had been presented as a promotion, with a title change from Security Analyst to Senior Systems Architect. The pay increase had been minimal, but the message was clear. This was where older employees went to finish out their careers in comfortable obscurity. Margaret had accepted the transfer without complaint, but she had also begun her own investigation into the company's security posture. What she found had kept her awake for weeks. The legacy systems weren't isolated at all. They were connected to the main network through a web of forgotten bridges and inherited configurations that had been built up over decades of system upgrades. An attacker who gained access to these older systems could potentially move laterally through the entire corporate infrastructure. She had documented her findings in a detailed report, complete with network diagrams and proof-of-concept exploits. The report had been forwarded to the Security Division, where it had disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of corporate risk management. 3 months later, She had received a polite email thanking her for her valuable input and assuring her that her concerns were being carefully evaluated. Nothing had changed. Margaret had continued her investigation, working nights and weekends to map the complete network topology. She had discovered legacy application servers that were still running software from the 1990s, database systems with hard-coded passwords that hadn't been changed in over a decade, and backup systems that transmitted unencrypted data across the internal network. Each vulnerability was a potential entry point for an attacker who understood how to exploit the trust relationships between systems. The work had become an obsession. She arrived at the office before dawn and stayed late into the evening, her desk lamp often the only light in the basement level. Her colleagues had stopped inviting her to team lunches, and she had stopped attending the monthly department meetings. She wasn't antisocial. She was focused on a problem that nobody else seemed to understand. Her home life had suffered as well. Margaret lived alone in a small apartment in Capitol Hill, a neighborhood that had gentrified around her during her years in government service. Her ex-husband had moved to Phoenix after their divorce, and their daughter Emily called once a week, but rarely visited. Margaret's social circle had shrunk to a few former colleagues who had also left government service, and even those relationships had become strained as she became increasingly absorbed in her work. The apartment reflected her personality, functional, organized, and slightly outdated. Her living room contained a desk with 2 monitors where she continued her research in the evenings, surrounded by technical manuals and printouts of network diagrams. Her bedroom had a single bed, a dresser, and a bookshelf filled with cybersecurity texts and programming guides. She had stopped decorating years ago, after realizing that she spent more time at the office than at home. Margaret's daily routine had become a ritual of preparation. She woke at 4 a.m. without an alarm, her internal clock calibrated to the rhythm of system maintenance windows and backup schedules. She made coffee using a machine that was nearly as old as her mechanical keyboard, the familiar hiss and gurgle providing a comforting soundtrack to her morning preparations. She dressed in the same style of clothes every day, comfortable pants, a button-down shirt, and practical shoes that could handle the long hours of standing at her workstation. The drive to the office took her through the quiet streets of early morning Seattle, past coffee shops that were just opening and joggers who were finishing their runs. She parked in the same spot in the underground garage, a corner space that was never occupied because it required backing into a tight spot that most drivers avoided. Margaret preferred the challenge. It was a small reminder that she was still capable of precision under pressure. The security guard at the front desk had long since stopped asking to see her badge. Margaret had worked in the building for over 5 years, and her early morning arrivals had become part of the building's routine. She took the elevator to the basement level, where the server room's white noise created a cocoon of concentration that the open-plan offices upstairs couldn't match. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her workstation was always exactly as she had left it. The monitors were positioned at the correct angles, the keyboards were clean and ready, and her notebook was open to the page where she had stopped working the night before. She had developed a system of organization that allowed her to resume her investigation seamlessly, picking up threads of analysis that might have been interrupted by meetings or administrative tasks. The coffee from the building's cafe was terrible, but Margaret had learned to appreciate its consistency. She bought the same large coffee every morning at 8:30 a.m. when the cafe opened, and she always paid with exact change. The barista, a young woman named Jessica, who was working her way through computer science classes at the University of Washington, had started preparing Margaret's order when she saw her approaching the counter. "Same as always?" Jessica would ask, already reaching for the largest cup. "Same as always," Margaret would reply, leaving a $2 tip that was larger than the Cost of the coffee itself. It was one of the few human interactions Margaret had during her workday. She had learned to avoid the break room, where conversations about weekend plans and dating apps made her feel like an outsider. She ate lunch at her desk, usually a sandwich from the deli across the street, while reviewing system logs and network traffic patterns. Her colleagues had stopped trying to include her in their social activities, and she had stopped trying to fit in with their culture. But Margaret's isolation wasn't complete. She had maintained contact with a small network of former government colleagues who had also transitioned to private sector work. They communicated through encrypted messaging apps and met occasionally at a coffee shop in Georgetown that was popular with federal employees. These meetings provided Margaret with a connection to a world where her experience was still valued, where technical expertise mattered more than age or corporate politics. One of these colleagues, David Rodriguez, had warned her about the challenges of corporate security work. "The hardest part isn't the technical stuff," he had said during one of their meetings. "It's convincing people that threats are real when they can't see them. In government, everyone understands that the enemy is trying to get in. In corporate, they think security is just another cost center." Margaret had understood his warning, but she hadn't fully appreciated its implications until she had spent months trying to get Datacorp's leadership to take her findings seriously. The company's security posture was built on the assumption that modern threats could be addressed with modern solutions. They had invested millions in next-generation firewalls, artificial intelligence-powered threat detection systems, and security awareness training for employees. But they had ignored the foundation upon which their entire infrastructure was built. The legacy systems weren't just outdated. They were invisible. They had been running for so long that they had become part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and overlooked as the electrical wiring or plumbing. New employees didn't know they existed, and veteran employees had learned to work around their limitations without questioning their security implications. Margaret had become the unofficial guardian of these forgotten systems. She understood their quirks and vulnerabilities better than anyone else in the company, and she had developed a deep appreciation for their robust design. The older systems had been built during an era when security meant isolation, when networks were small and threats were simple. They had been designed to fail safely, to shut down rather than compromise their integrity. But they had also been designed for a world that no longer existed. The internet had transformed from a research network into a global communications infrastructure, and the threats had evolved accordingly. Modern attackers use sophisticated techniques that could exploit the trust relationships between systems, moving laterally through networks until they found their targets. The legacy systems weren't just vulnerable. They were potential gateways into the heart of Datacorp's most sensitive data. Margaret's investigation had revealed the true scope of the problem. The company's financial systems, customer databases, and intellectual property were all connected through a web of legacy integrations that had been built over decades of system upgrades. An attacker who gained access to the right legacy system could potentially access any part of the corporate network, bypassing all of the modern security controls that the company had invested in. She had tried to explain this to her manager, Robert Kim, during their monthly one-on-one meetings. Robert was a decent manager who had been promoted from the network operations team, but he didn't have the background to understand the implications of Margaret's findings. He listened politely to her concerns and promised to escalate them to the appropriate stakeholders. But nothing ever changed. The frustration had driven Margaret to work longer hours and dig deeper into the systems. She had begun to think of herself as the company's immune system, the one person who was watching for threats that everyone else had forgotten about. The work was exhausting and thankless, but it was also necessary. She had seen what happened to organizations that ignored their foundational security, and she was determined not to let Datacorp become another cautionary tale. Now, as she sat in the server room at 4:47 a.m., Margaret knew that her vigilance had been justified. The pattern she had discovered in the network logs was proof that someone was testing their defenses, someone who understood the same vulnerabilities that she had been warning about for years. The attacker was patient, sophisticated, and focused. On the exact systems that everyone else had dismissed as irrelevant, Margaret saved her analysis to an encrypted file and leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning from hours of screen time. The coffee had gone cold, but she took a sip anyway, the bitter taste of familiar comfort in the pre-dawn darkness. She had found what she was looking for, but she also knew that convincing anyone else would be the hardest part of her job. Server room's white noise continued its steady rhythm, the sound of machines that never slept, never complained, and never gave up. Margaret understood that rhythm. She had become part of it, another component in the infrastructure that kept the company running. She might be called outdated, but she was also irreplaceable. And somewhere in the network traffic, hidden beneath layers of legitimate data, an attacker was counting on everyone else's blindness to her value. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor felt like a different planet from the server room basement. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries cut white lines through the gray water. The table was a slab of polished granite surrounded by ergonomic chairs that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. At the head of the table sat Alex Morrison, Datacorp's chief technology officer, a man whose reputation had been built on his ability to simplify complex problems into actionable business strategies. Margaret had been invited to this meeting as a subject matter expert, though she suspected her presence was more about corporate thoroughness than genuine interest in her insights. She sat near the end of the table, her printed report and hand-annotated network diagrams, looking primitive next to the sleek tablets and laptops that everyone else carried. "Let's start with the quarterly security review," Alex announced, his voice carrying the confident cadence of someone who had never doubted his own expertise. "I want to hear from each division about their threat landscape and mitigation strategies." The presentations began with the cloud security team, led by Brandon Walsh, a 32-year-old who had joined Datacorp after completing a prestigious cybersecurity boot camp. Brandon's slides were beautifully designed, filled with colorful charts and industry buzzwords that painted a picture of a security program that was both comprehensive and cutting-edge. "Our AI-powered threat detection system has achieved a 99.7% accuracy rate in identifying malicious activity," Brandon explained, clicking through slides that showed declining threat metrics and increasing security investments. "We've implemented zero-trust architecture across all cloud workloads, and our security awareness training has reduced phishing susceptibility by 40%. Alex nodded approvingly. "Excellent work." "What about the endpoint security team?" Sarah Martinez, the endpoint security manager, stood to present her division's achievements. Sarah was in her late 20s and had built her career on her ability to implement enterprise security solutions quickly and efficiently. Her presentation focused on the deployment of next-generation endpoint protection across the company's fleet of laptops and mobile devices. "We've achieved 100% deployment of our new endpoint detection and response platform," Sarah reported. "The system uses machine learning to identify anomalous behavior patterns and can automatically isolate infected devices before they can spread malware to other systems." The presentations continued through each division: network security, application security, identity, and access management. Each team leader presented metrics that showed improving security posture, reduced incident response times, and increased employee compliance with security policies. The narrative was consistent. Datacorp was a modern company with modern security challenges, and they were addressing those challenges with state-of-the-art solutions. Margaret listened to each presentation with growing unease. The security program being described was impressive in scope and sophisticated in implementation, but it was also built on a foundation that nobody was discussing: the legacy systems that underpinned the company's entire Infrastructure were being treated as if they didn't exist. When the presentations concluded, Alex turned to Margaret with the kind of polite attention that managers reserve for obligatory consultations. "Margaret, I know you've been working on some analysis of our older systems. Do you have anything to add to what we've heard today?" Margaret opened her notebook and referred to the careful notes she had prepared. "I've been reviewing the security posture of our legacy infrastructure, and I've identified several concerns that I think merit attention." She began to explain her findings, describing the network topology that connected decades-old systems to the modern corporate infrastructure. She outlined the vulnerabilities she had discovered, the hard-coded passwords that hadn't been changed in years, and the unencrypted data transmission protocols that could be exploited by a sophisticated attacker. As she spoke, Margaret noticed that the attention in the room was shifting. Brandon was checking his phone. Sarah was reviewing her own presentation slides. Even Alex, who had invited her to speak, seemed to be losing interest as she delved into the technical details of her analysis. "I've prepared a detailed report," Margaret continued, "that documents 47 specific vulnerabilities in our legacy systems. These systems have direct or indirect connections to our financial databases, customer information systems, and intellectual property repositories. An attacker who gained access to these legacy systems could potentially move laterally through our entire network infrastructure." She paused, waiting for questions or comments. The room was quiet, but not with the focused attention of people processing important information. It was the polite silence of people waiting for a presentation to end. Brandon was the first to speak. "Margaret, I appreciate the thoroughness of your analysis, but I think we need to keep this in perspective. The legacy systems you're describing represent a tiny fraction of our overall infrastructure. Our threat detection systems monitor all network traffic, including traffic from older systems. If there was a real threat, we would have detected it." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Plus, these older systems are mostly isolated from the internet. They're not exposed to the same attack vectors that we see targeting modern systems. Our security investments are focused on the areas where we see actual threats." Margaret felt a familiar frustration building in her chest. "The isolation isn't complete," she said carefully. "I've documented multiple connection points between legacy systems and the modern network. An attacker doesn't need direct internet access to these systems if they can reach them through lateral movement." Alex leaned forward, his expression showing the kind of patient condescension that Margaret had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Margaret, I want to be clear that we value your expertise and your attention to detail. But we also need to balance thoroughness with practical risk management. We can't secure every theoretical vulnerability, especially in systems that are scheduled for retirement." "When are they scheduled for retirement?" Margaret asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. Alex glanced at his CTO dashboard, then at the other managers around the table. "The legacy system migration is part of our 5-year strategic plan," he said finally. "We'll be evaluating timeline and resource allocation as part of the next budget cycle." Margaret understood corporate speak well enough to know that this meant the systems would continue running indefinitely. The cost and complexity of migrating decades of legacy applications was too high to justify unless there was a crisis that demanded immediate action. "In the meantime," Alex continued, "I think our resources are better invested in the security programs that Brandon and Sarah have described. These are the areas where we're seeing actual threats, not theoretical vulnerabilities in systems that most attackers don't even know exist." The meeting moved on to other topics: budget allocations for the next quarter, staffing plans for the expanding cloud security team, and preparations for the upcoming security audit. Margaret continued to take notes, but she felt increasingly disconnected from the conversation. The security program being discussed was designed to address the threats that everyone could see and understand. not the risks that required deep technical knowledge to recognize. After the meeting, Margaret gathered her materials and prepared to return to the basement level. As she waited for the elevator, Brandon approached her with what appeared to be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. "Hey Margaret, I hope you didn't take my comments the wrong way," he said. "I know you've got a lot of experience with these older systems, and that knowledge is valuable. But I think we need to focus our security efforts on the areas where we can make the biggest impact." Margaret nodded politely. "I understand your perspective, Brandon. But I think there's value in understanding the complete attack surface, not just the parts that are visible to modern security tools." Brandon smiled. "Sure, but we also can't let perfect be the enemy of good, you know. We've got limited resources and unlimited potential threats. We have to prioritize based on actual risk, not theoretical scenarios." The elevator arrived and Margaret stepped inside. As the doors closed, she heard Brandon talking to Sarah about their plans for the next security conference, their conversation moving seamlessly from her concerns to their professional development opportunities. The pattern repeated itself in various forms over the following weeks. Margaret would identify a vulnerability or unusual network activity, document her findings, and present them to the appropriate stakeholders. The responses were always polite but dismissive, couched in the language of risk management and resource allocation. During the monthly IT leadership meeting, Margaret presented her analysis of suspicious network traffic patterns. The data showed systematic probing of legacy application servers, with attack signatures that suggested a sophisticated adversary with deep knowledge of the system's architecture. "These aren't random attacks," Margaret explained to the assembled managers. "The targeting is too specific, the timing too deliberate. Someone is conducting reconnaissance on our legacy infrastructure with the kind of patience that suggests a long-term campaign." Robert Kim, her direct manager, responded with the kind of diplomatic language that had become familiar. "Margaret raises some interesting points, but I think we need to be careful about reading too much into normal network noise. Our Security Operations Center monitors all network traffic, and they haven't flagged any of this activity as suspicious." The Security Operations Center was staffed by analysts who had been trained to recognize the signatures of known malware and common attack techniques. They were skilled at their jobs, but their tools and training were focused on the threats that appeared in industry reports and vendor briefings. They weren't equipped to recognize the subtle indicators of a custom attack targeting proprietary systems. Margaret tried to explain this distinction, but her words seemed to disappear into the corpor, a deep bureaucracy of risk assessment and process management. The security team was performing well according to their metrics, which measured response times to known threats and compliance with established security frameworks. Her concerns about unknown threats and custom attack methods didn't fit into their measurement systems. The frustration was compounded by the generational divide that permeated the company's culture. DataCore prided itself on being a young, innovative company that attracted top talent from the best universities and training programs. The average age of employees in the security division was 31, and the leadership team was populated by people who had built their careers during the Internet age. Margaret's experience with mainframe systems and network protocols from the 1980s was seen as historical curiosity rather than practical expertise. When she referenced attack techniques that had been used against government systems decades earlier, her colleagues listened with the polite attention that people reserve for stories about outdated technology. "That's interesting history," Sarah had said after Margaret described a social engineering attack that had compromised a federal agency's legacy database system. But modern attackers use completely different techniques. They're focused on cloud environments and mobile devices, not old terminal systems. The irony was that Margaret's historical knowledge was exactly what made her uniquely qualified to recognize the current threat. The attack patterns she was seeing in the network traffic were sophisticated variations on techniques that had been used against similar systems for decades. The attackers weren't using modern methods because they didn't need to. They were exploiting vulnerabilities that had existed since the systems were first deployed. But explaining this required a level of technical detail that most of her colleagues couldn't follow, and a historical perspective that they didn't value. Margaret found herself in the position of being the only person who understood both the nature of the threat and the vulnerability of the systems, while being surrounded by people who were experts in security domains that didn't overlap with her knowledge. The social dynamics of the situation were even more challenging than the technical ones. Margaret had learned to navigate corporate politics during her government career, but the private sector operated according to different rules. Success was measured by quarterly metrics and annual performance reviews, not by the prevention of disasters that never happened. Her colleagues in the security division were building their careers on their ability to implement modern security solutions and demonstrate measurable improvements in security posture. They attended conferences where they learned about the latest threat intelligence and security technologies, and they networked with peers who faced similar challenges in similar environments. Margaret's expertise didn't translate into the same kind of career advancement opportunities. There were no conferences focused on legacy system security, no certification programs for obsolete technologies, and no vendor relationships that could enhance her professional network. She was becoming increasingly isolated within her own field, an expert in systems that the industry had decided were no longer relevant. The isolation was reinforced by the company's social culture. DataCore had invested heavily in creating a workplace that appealed to younger employees. Open office spaces, recreational facilities, catered meals, and social events that fostered collaboration and innovation. The culture was designed around the assumption that employees would work long hours in exchange for a dynamic, engaging work environment. Margaret had tried to participate in these social activities, but she found herself increasingly uncomfortable in settings where her age and interests made her an outsider. The conversations at company happy hours focused on topics that she couldn't relate to: dating apps, streaming services, and career ambitions that assumed decades of future opportunity. She had stopped attending the optional team-building events and lunch and learn sessions that were designed to foster collaboration across departments. Instead, she ate lunch alone at her desk, reviewing system logs and network traffic patterns while her colleagues socialized in the cafeteria upstairs. The isolation wasn't just social, it was professional. Margaret's expertise was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the company's strategic direction. DataCore was migrating applications to cloud platforms, implementing microservices architectures, and adopting development methodologies that emphasize speed and agility over the stability and security that had defined her career. The legacy systems that she understood so well were being treated as technical debt, obstacles to innovation that would eventually be replaced by modern solutions. Her role as their guardian was temporary by definition, a caretaking position that would be eliminated once the systems were finally retired. But Margaret knew something that her colleagues didn't. The legacy systems weren't going away anytime soon. The cost and complexity of migrating decades of custom applications was too high to justify unless there was a crisis that demanded immediate action. The systems would continue running, largely ignored and increasingly vulnerable, until something forced the company to address their security implications. She had seen this pattern before, during her government career. Critical infrastructure. Systems that were too important to shut down, but too old to secure properly. The solution was always the same: maintain the status quo until a crisis forced change, then scramble to implement security measures that should have been in place years earlier. Margaret had hoped that the private sector would be different, that corporate incentives would drive more proactive security measures. Instead, she had discovered that the pressure for short-term results made the problem worse. Security investments were evaluated based on their immediate impact on measurable metrics, not their long-term protection against sophisticated threats. Quarterly security review meetings had become exercises in reporting positive metrics, rather than honest assessments of security posture. Everyone wanted to show improvement, progress, and success. Margaret's warnings about hidden vulnerabilities and sophisticated threats didn't fit into this narrative. As she sat in the server room, reviewing the latest network traffic analysis, Margaret realized that her professional isolation had become complete. She was the only person in the company who understood the true nature of the threat, and the only person whose warnings were being systematically ignored. The pattern she had identified in the network logs was becoming more pronounced, more systematic. The attackers were no longer just probing for vulnerabilities. They were mapping the network topology, identifying the relationships between systems, and preparing for something bigger. Margaret updated her analysis, documented the latest attack signatures, and prepared another report for the security leadership team. She knew that it would be received with the same polite dismissal as all her previous warnings, but she also knew that she had to continue trying. Somewhere in the network traffic, hidden beneath layers of legitimate data, an adversary was counting on everyone else's inability to see what she could see. They were betting that a company full of security experts would overlook the expertise of someone who had been dismissed as outdated. They were probably right. The first sign of trouble came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when Margaret's phone buzzed with an automated alert from the legacy monitoring system she had built herself. She was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a printout of network traffic patterns that had been bothering her for weeks. The alert was simple: unusual authentication attempts on finance_DB_primary. Margaret's apartment was quiet except for the hum of her home workstation and the distant sound of traffic on Pine Street. She had been tracking the systematic probing of datacore systems for over a month now, documenting each reconnaissance attempt with the methodical precision that had made her valuable to the NSA. The attackers were patient, skilled, and clearly working from detailed intelligence about the company's infrastructure. She opened her laptop and connected to the secure VPN tunnel she had configured to monitor the legacy systems from home. The authentication log showed exactly what she had been dreading. Someone had successfully logged into the financial database server using credentials that shouldn't have existed. The account name was mate_USER, a maintenance account that had been disabled 3 years ago. According to the official documentation, Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up the account management records. The mate_user account had indeed been disabled in the primary directory, but she discovered it was still active in the legacy authentication system that the financial database used for backward compatibility. It was exactly the kind of oversight that happened when companies layered new security systems on top of old infrastructure without properly auditing the connections between them. The intruder had used the account to access customer financial records, transaction histories, and account balances for over 40,000 clients. They had also downloaded schema information that would allow them to understand the database structure and identify the most valuable data for future attacks. The breach had been active for 6 hours before Margaret's monitoring system detected it. She immediately began documenting the incident, taking screenshots of the authentication logs and database access records. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had been preparing for this moment for months, building detection systems and response procedures that the official security team didn't even know existed. Margaret's first call was to the Security Operations Center, where the night shift analyst on duty was Kevin Torres, a recent graduate from a cybersecurity program who had joined Datacore 6 months earlier. Kevin was competent and well-trained, but his experience was limited to the types of incidents that appeared in textbooks and certification exams. SOC. this is Kevin. Kevin, this is Margaret Chun from Legacy Systems. We have an active breach on the financial database server. Someone has accessed customer records using a compromised maintenance account. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret, I'm not showing any alerts for the financial systems. Are you sure this isn't a false positive? Margaret had expected this response. The SOC's monitoring systems were focused on the modern infrastructure and weren't configured to detect anomalies in the legacy authentication protocols. I'm looking at the raw authentication logs. The account mate_user has been accessing customer data for the past 6 hours. This is a confirmed breach. Kevin's voice carried a note of uncertainty. I need to escalate this to my supervisor. Can you send me the evidence you're looking at? Margaret was already preparing the incident report, but she knew that the escalation process would take time that they didn't have. The attackers were still active in the system, and every minute of delay gave them more opportunity to extract valuable data or establish persistent access. I'm sending you the documentation now, Margaret said. But we need to take immediate action to contain this breach. The attacker has administrative access to the financial database. Margaret, I understand your concern, but we have procedures for incident response. I need to get my supervisor involved before we can take any containment actions. Margaret hung up and immediately called Robert Kim, her direct manager. Robert answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Robert, we have a situation. There's an active breach on the financial database server. I've contacted the SOC, but they're following escalation procedures. We need to take immediate action. Robert's response was predictable. Margaret, slow down. Walk me through what you're seeing. Are you sure this is a real incident and not a monitoring glitch? Margaret had learned to be precise in her language when dealing with managers who didn't have the technical background to understand the urgency of security incidents. I have confirmed that an unauthorized user has accessed customer financial records using a compromised maintenance account. The breach has been active for over 6 hours, and the attacker is still connected to the system. Okay, but why didn't the SOC detect this? They have monitoring systems for the financial databases. The SOC's monitoring systems don't cover the legacy authentication protocols. This is exactly the kind of blind spot I've been warning about in my reports. Robert was quiet for a moment. Margaret, I need you to document everything you're seeing and send it to me. I'll contact Alex Morrison and the security leadership team. But we need to be sure we're not creating a false alarm. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of being asked to prove that a crisis was real while the crisis was still unfolding. Robert, while we're documenting and escalating, the attackers are extracting customer data. We need to disable the compromised account and isolate the database server. Margaret, I understand your urgency, but we can't just start shutting down systems without proper authorization. The financial database supports critical business operations. Margaret realized that she was going to have to take action without official approval. The corporate incident response procedures were designed for threats that were detected and contained by the official security team, not for sophisticated attacks that exploited the gaps between legacy and modern systems. Robert, I'm going to implement emergency containment measures. I'll document everything and take full responsibility. Margaret, wait. Don't do anything until we can get the security team involved. Margaret had already hung up. She opened the database administration console and began the process of disabling the compromised account. The system prompted her for authorization, and she entered her emergency access credentials, a set of administrative privileges that she had maintained for exactly this kind of situation. The account was disabled within seconds, but Margaret knew that experienced attackers would have anticipated this response. She began checking for signs of persistent access, backdoor accounts, scheduled tasks, or modified system files that would allow the attackers to regain access even after their initial entry point was closed. What she found was worse than she had expected. The attackers had created 3 additional user accounts with administrative privileges, scheduled a task to run a data extraction script every hour, and modified the database logging configuration to hide their activities. They had also installed a custom communication tool that allowed them to control the system remotely without using standard network protocols. Margaret documented each discovery, while simultaneously working to remove the malicious components. The attackers had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this operation, and they had demonstrated a deep understanding of the database system's architecture and security controls. Her phone buzzed with a call from Alex Morrison, the CTO. Margaret answered while continuing her containment efforts. "Margaret, Robert tells me you've detected some kind of security incident. I need to understand what's happening before we take any disruptive actions." "Alex, we have a confirmed breach of the financial database. The attackers have administrative access and have been extracting customer data for hours. I'm in the process of containing the incident." "Margaret, I need you to stop what you're doing and wait for the security team to assess the situation. We can't have people making unauthorized changes to critical systems." Margaret's screen showed that the attackers were attempting to re-establish their connection using one of the backdoor accounts she hadn't yet removed. "Alex, the attackers are actively trying to regain access. Every second we delay gives them more opportunity to cause damage." "Margaret, I understand your concern, but we have established procedures for incident response. Brandon Walsh is on his way to the office, and he'll coordinate with the SOC to assess the situation properly." Margaret knew that Brandon Walsh, despite his impressive credentials and modern security training, had never dealt with an attack on legacy systems. His expertise was in cloud security and endpoint protection, not in the database technologies and authentication protocols that the attackers were exploiting. "Alex, Brandon doesn't have experience with these legacy systems. By the time he gets up to speed, the attackers will have accomplished their objectives." "Margaret, Brandon is our senior security architect. He's qualified to handle any type of security incident. I need you to step back and let the professionals handle this." The word professionals hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had spent 15 years as a cybersecurity professional at one of the most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world, and she was being told to step aside for someone whose experience was limited to corporate security implementations. "Alex, I am a professional. I have more experience with these types of attacks than anyone else in the company. I've been warning about this exact scenario for months. Margaret, I'm not questioning your technical skills, but this is a complex incident that requires coordination across multiple teams. We need to follow established procedures." Margaret's screen showed that the attackers had successfully reconnected using a backdoor account that she hadn't yet identified. They were now attempting to modify the database schema, possibly to ensure persistent access or to facilitate future attacks. "Alex, I'm watching the attackers modify our database in real time. We don't have time for procedures." "Margaret, I'm ordering you to stop making changes to the system. We'll handle this through proper channels." Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She muted the phone call and continued her containment efforts, working rapidly to identify and remove the remaining backdoor accounts. She could hear Alex's voice through the phone, but she ignored it as she focused on the technical challenge of outwitting attackers who had clearly spent months planning this operation. The next hour was a blur of technical combat. Margaret identified and removed 7 backdoor accounts, disabled 3 malicious scheduled tasks, and restored the original database login configuration. She also discovered that the attackers had modified the database's backup procedures to ensure that their changes would be preserved, even if the system was restored from backup. That each discovery revealed new layers of the attack's sophistication. The attackers had not only gained access to the financial database, but had also established a beachhead that would allow them to launch attacks against other systems in the network. They had downloaded network topology information, system configuration files, and user account lists that would be valuable for future operations. Margaret documented everything while she worked, knowing that she would need to justify her actions to executives who didn't understand the technical details of what she was doing. She captured screenshots of the malicious components, logged the timeline of the attack, and preserved evidence that would be crucial for any forensic investigation. By 4:30 a.m., she had successfully contained the immediate threat, the attackers. Access had been eliminated, the malicious components had been removed, and the database was secured against similar attacks. She had also implemented additional monitoring and access controls that would detect any future attempts to exploit the same vulnerabilities. Margaret's phone had been buzzing with calls and messages for the past hour, but she had ignored them while focusing on the technical response. Now, with the immediate crisis resolved, she began reviewing the communications she had missed. There were 17 missed calls from Alex Morrison, 6 from Robert Kim, and 12 from Brandon Walsh. The text messages ranged from concerned inquiries to direct orders to stop her containment efforts. The most recent message, sent 10 minutes earlier, was from Alex. "Margaret, you are to cease all activities immediately and report to my office at 6 a.m. Margaret leaned back in her chair and took a deep breath. She had successfully contained a sophisticated attack that could have resulted in the theft of financial information for tens of thousands of customers. She had also violated direct orders from the CTO and bypassed the established incident response procedures. She opened her laptop and began preparing a comprehensive incident report, documenting every aspect of the attack and her response. The report would serve as both a technical analysis of the breach and a defense of her actions. She knew that she would need to justify every decision she had made during the crisis. As she worked, Margaret realized that this incident would change everything. For months, she had been warning about the vulnerabilities in the legacy systems, and those warnings had been dismissed as the paranoid concerns of an outdated employee. Now, her predictions had been validated in the most dramatic way possible. The attackers had exploited exactly the types of vulnerabilities that she had identified in her reports. They had used the trust relationships between legacy and modern systems to bypass the security controls that the company had invested millions of dollars to implement. They had demonstrated that the company's security posture was fundamentally flawed, built on assumptions that didn't account for the realities of hybrid infrastructure. But Margaret also knew that her response to the crisis would be controversial. She had acted without authorization, ignored direct orders from senior executives, and bypassed established procedures. From a corporate perspective, she had committed serious insubordination, regardless of the technical success of her actions. The sun was beginning to rise over Seattle as Margaret finished her incident report. She had been awake for over 24 hours, but she felt strangely energized. For the first time in months, she had been able to use her skills for their intended purpose, protecting the company's most valuable assets from sophisticated threats. She saved the report to an encrypted file and began preparing for the confrontation that would inevitably follow. She had no illusions about the political consequences of her actions, but she also had no regrets about the technical decisions she had made. Margaret had spent her career preparing for moments like this, when technical expertise and quick thinking could prevent disasters that would otherwise be inevitable. She had been ready when the moment came, even if nobody else had recognized the urgency of the situation. The phone rang again. This time, it was Brandon Walsh. "Margaret, I need to understand what happened. Alex is furious, and I'm trying to get up to speed on the incident." Margaret looked at her screen, where the database monitoring systems showed normal activity for the first time in hours. "Brandon, I contained a sophisticated attack on the financial database. The attackers had administrative access and were extracting customer data. Margaret, I understand that you detected something, but you should have waited for the security team to respond. We have procedures for a reason. Margaret felt the familiar weight of having to explain complex technical issues to someone who didn't have the background to understand them. Brandon, the attackers were active in the system. Every minute of delay would have given them more opportunity to extract data or establish persistent access. Margaret, that's exactly why we have incident response procedures. Security incidents are complex, and they require coordinated responses from multiple teams. You can't just start making changes to critical systems without proper authorization. Margaret realized that even now, after successfully containing the attack, she was being criticized for her methods rather than praised for her results. Corporate culture that had dismissed her warnings was now criticizing her response to the crisis that those warnings had predicted. Brandon, I prevented a major data breach that could have affected tens of thousands of customers. I think the results speak for themselves. Margaret, I'm not questioning your technical skills, but we need to follow established procedures. What you did was reckless, regardless of the outcome. Margaret hung up and began gathering her materials for the meeting with Alex Morrison. She knew that the next few hours would determine whether her career at Datacorp would continue or end, but she also knew that she had done the right thing. The attack had been contained. The customer data had been protected, and the company's reputation had been preserved. Margaret had been ready when the moment came, even if nobody else had recognized the threat until it was almost too late. As she prepared to leave for the office, Margaret looked at the photograph of her brother Ben that sat on her desk. She had kept her promise to be ready when someone needed her, even if that someone was a company that had spent months dismissing her expertise. The real test would be whether anyone would listen to her warnings about the vulnerabilities that still remained in the system, or whether they would focus on the procedural violations that had made her successful response possible. Margaret locked her laptop and headed for the door. The crisis was over, but the battle for recognition and respect was just beginning. The executive conference room at 6 a.m. felt like a tribunal. Alex Morrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by Chief Security Officer Patricia Valdez and General Counsel Thomas Hartley. Brandon Walsh occupied the chair where Margaret usually sat during security meetings, his laptop open to what appeared to be an incident timeline. Margaret entered carrying her leather portfolio and a printed copy of her comprehensive incident report. Her expression calm despite having had no sleep. Alex's voice was controlled but carried an undercurrent of barely contained anger. Margaret, I want to start by saying that what happened this morning was completely unacceptable. You violated direct orders from senior leadership and potentially compromised our incident response capabilities. Patricia Valdez, a former FBI cybercrime investigator who had joined Datacorp 6 months earlier, leaned forward with the kind of intense focus that Margaret recognized from her government days. Before we discuss disciplinary actions, I need to understand exactly what happened. Brandon has briefed me on the technical details, but I want to hear your perspective. Margaret opened her portfolio and placed her incident report on the table. At 2:17 a.m., I detected unauthorized access to the financial database server through a compromised maintenance account. The attacker had administrative privileges and was actively extracting customer data. I attempted to follow proper escalation procedures, but the SOC and management response was too slow to prevent significant data theft. Thomas Hartley, the general counsel, was taking notes on a legal pad. Margaret, help me understand the timeline. When did you first contact the Security Operations Center? 2:23 a.m. I spoke with Kevin Torres and provided him with detailed evidence of the breach. He said he needed to escalate to his supervisor before taking any containment actions. Brandon spoke up, consulting his laptop. Kevin followed proper procedures. Security incidents require coordinated response from multiple teams. You can't just start making changes to production systems without authorization. Margaret had expected this response. Brandon, while Kevin was following procedures, the attackers extracted financial records for over 40,000 customers. They also established 7 backdoor accounts and modified the database backup procedures to ensure persistent access. Patricia's expression shifted to one of sharp interest. 7 backdoor accounts? That suggests a sophisticated, well-planned operation. How long had they been in the system? Margaret referred to her notes. Based on the authentication logs, initial reconnaissance began 11 weeks ago. The attackers spent months mapping our network topology and identifying the trust relationships between legacy and modern systems. Alex interrupted, his frustration evident. Margaret, that's exactly my point. If this was such a sophisticated operation, why didn't our security team detect it? We've invested millions in threat detection and response capabilities. Because the attacks targeted systems that aren't monitored by your modern security tools. Margaret replied, the legacy authentication protocols operate independently from the centralized identity management system. Your security investments focused on the visible infrastructure, not the foundation that supports it. Brandon's fingers moved across his laptop keyboard as he pulled up security dashboards. Margaret, our SIEM system monitors all network traffic. If there had been a real threat, it would have generated alerts. Margaret had anticipated this argument. She opened her portfolio and removed a network diagram that she had prepared months earlier. Brandon, your SIEM system monitors traffic between modern systems. But the legacy database uses a proprietary authentication protocol that was developed in 1987. The SIEM doesn't understand the traffic patterns well enough to identify anomalies. She placed the diagram on the table, pointing to the connections between systems. The attackers understood our architecture better than our own security team. They exploited the trust relationships between legacy and modern systems to bypass every security control you've implemented. Patricia studied the diagram with the kind of attention that Margaret hadn't seen from anyone at DataCore since her arrival. This is a sophisticated attack vector. How did you detect it when our automated systems missed it? I built custom monitoring tools specifically for the legacy systems, Margaret explained. I've been tracking unusual activity for months and documenting attack patterns that suggested systematic reconnaissance. Thomas looked up from his legal pad. Margaret, when you say you built custom monitoring tools, do you mean you deployed unauthorized software on company systems? Margaret felt the familiar weight of having to justify technical decisions to people who didn't understand their necessity. I developed monitoring scripts that analyze authentication logs and network traffic patterns. The tools run on my workstation and don't modify any production systems. Alex's expression had shifted from anger to something that might have been concern. Margaret, why didn't you report this monitoring system to the security team? We need to know about all security tools deployed in our environment. I documented the monitoring system in my quarterly reports, Margaret replied. I also offered to share the tools with Brandon's team, but they said they weren't needed because the SIEM provided comprehensive coverage. Brandon's face flushed slightly. Margaret, you never provided me with technical specifications for your monitoring tools. You mentioned them in passing, but you didn't offer to integrate them with our security infrastructure. Margaret opened her portfolio and removed a printed email chain. Brandon, I sent you a detailed technical proposal 4 months ago. You replied that the security team was focused on modernizing our capabilities and didn't have resources to support legacy monitoring tools. The room fell silent as Brandon scanned the email printout. Patricia broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of the issue. Margaret, in your professional opinion, how much customer data was at risk during this attack? Margaret had spent hours analyzing the scope of the breach. The attackers accessed financial records for approximately 43,000 customers, including account numbers, transaction histories, and personal identification information. They also downloaded schema information that would allow them to target specific, high-value accounts in future attacks. Thomas was writing furiously. What's our potential legal exposure from this breach? If the attackers had completed their operation, we would be looking at GDPR violations, SOX compliance failures, and potential class action lawsuits, Margaret replied. The regulatory fines alone could have reached 8 figures. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Margaret, walk me through your containment actions. I need to understand exactly what you did to stop the attack. Margaret consulted her incident timeline. I disabled the compromised maintenance account at 2:31 a.m. I then identified and removed 7 backdoor accounts that the attackers had created. I also disabled 3 malicious scheduled tasks and restored the original database logging configuration. How long did the full containment take? Patricia asked. Approximately 90 minutes. The attackers attempted to re-establish access multiple times during the containment process, which suggests they were actively monitoring the system. Brandon looked up from his laptop. Margaret, you should have waited for the security team to coordinate the response. Containment actions need to be planned and executed systematically to preserve evidence and prevent collateral damage. Margaret felt a flash of the frustration that had been building for months. Brandon, the attackers, were extracting customer data in real time. Every minute of delay would have increased the scope of the breach. Patricia held up her hand to stop the argument. Let me ask a different question. Margaret, what would have happened if you had followed the established incident response procedures? Margaret had modeled this scenario in her head dozens of times. The escalation process would have taken at least 3 hours. During that time, the attackers would have completed their data extraction and established permanent access to our network. We would be dealing with a catastrophic breach instead of a contained incident. Alex was studying the network diagram that Margaret had provided. Margaret, I'm trying to understand how this attack was possible. Our security audit last year didn't identify any critical vulnerabilities in the financial systems. The security audit focused on the database server itself, not the authentication infrastructure that supports it, Margaret explained. The vulnerability existed in the legacy identity management system that was installed before the database was deployed. Thomas looked up from his notes. When was this legacy system installed? 1994, Margaret replied. It's been upgraded multiple times, but the core authentication protocols haven't changed. The system was designed for a network environment that no longer exists. Patricia was asking the kinds of questions that Margaret had hoped to hear from the security team for months. Margaret, are there other legacy systems with similar vulnerabilities? Margaret opened her portfolio and removed a thick document. I've identified 47 systems with comparable risk profiles. Most of them have trust relationships with modern systems that could be exploited by sophisticated attackers. Brandon's expression had shifted from defensive to genuinely concerned. Margaret, why haven't we been briefed on these vulnerabilities? I've submitted quarterly reports documenting these issues for the past 2 years, Margaret replied, placing copies of her reports on the table. The responses consistently indicated that legacy system security wasn't a priority for resource allocation. Alex picked up one of the reports and began scanning the executive summary. Margaret, these reports are extremely detailed. Why didn't anyone escalate these concerns to the C-level? Thomas was reviewing his notes with the kind of attention that suggested legal implications were becoming clear. Alex, we need to understand our exposure. If Margaret identified these vulnerabilities 2 years ago and we failed to address them, we could face negligence claims. Patricia was studying Margaret's vulnerability assessment with the focused attention of someone who understood the technical implications. Margaret, this is sophisticated analysis. Where did you acquire this level of expertise in legacy system security? Margaret had been dreading this question, knowing that her background would either validate her expertise or make her seem overqualified for her current position. I spent 15 years with the National Security Agency, specializing in infrastructure, protection and advanced persistent threat detection. The room fell silent. Alex looked up from the report he was reading. Margaret, your resume doesn't mention NSA experience. Federal Systems Integration was the contracting company that managed my security clearance, Margaret explained. I wasn't permitted to discuss the specific nature of my work during the hiring process. Patricia's expression had changed completely. Margaret, what was your role at NSA? I was a senior analyst in the Critical Infrastructure Protection Division. I specialized in hunting state-sponsored attackers who targeted government and corporate networks. Brandon was staring at her with something that might have been shocking. Margaret, you're telling us that you have 15 years of experience hunting sophisticated cyber attackers? That's correct. Alex set down the report and looked directly at Margaret. Margaret, why didn't you tell us about this background when you identified these vulnerabilities? Margaret had asked herself this question many times. Alex, I tried to communicate the seriousness of the threats through my reports and presentations. When those warnings were dismissed, I didn't think my background would make a difference. Patricia was reviewing Margaret's incident timeline with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Margaret, in your professional opinion, was this attack the work of a state-sponsored group? Margaret had been analyzing this question since the first reconnaissance attempts appeared in the logs. The attack methodology and sophistication level are consistent with apt groups that I tracked during my government career. The patience and systematic approach suggest professional adversaries with significant resources. Thomas was writing rapidly. Are we dealing with a national security issue? Potentially, Margaret replied. The attackers demonstrated deep knowledge of our infrastructure and targeted financial data that could be valuable for intelligence or criminal purposes. Alex was studying the network diagram again. Margaret, what's our current security posture? Are we protected against similar attacks? Margaret had prepared for this question. The immediate vulnerability has been contained, but the underlying architectural issues remain. The legacy systems are still connected to the modern infrastructure through trust relationships that could be exploited by determined attackers. Patricia closed her laptop and looked directly at Alex. We need to completely reassess our security strategy. Margaret has identified systemic vulnerabilities that our existing program wasn't designed to address. Brandon was still processing the revelation about Margaret's background. Margaret, why didn't you push harder to get these issues addressed? If you knew the risks were this serious, you should have escalated more aggressively. Margaret felt the weight of months of frustration and dismissal. Brandon, I provided detailed technical analysis, DOCUMENT, proof of concept exploits, and specific remediation recommendations. I was told repeatedly that legacy system security wasn't a priority. Alex stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Margaret, I owe you an apology. We clearly failed to recognize the value of your expertise. Thomas was reviewing his legal notes. Alex, we need to discuss our response strategy. Margaret's actions may have prevented a catastrophic breach, but we also need to address the procedural violations. Patricia shook her head. Thomas, Margaret's actions were consistent with emergency response protocols that would be standard in any government security environment. She identified a critical threat and took appropriate containment actions when the established procedures proved inadequate. Alex turned back to the table. Margaret, I want to understand what we need to do now. What are your recommendations for addressing the remaining vulnerabilities? Margaret opened her portfolio to the section she had been hoping to present for months. I've developed a comprehensive remediation plan that addresses the 47 vulnerable systems I've identified. The plan includes network segmentation, authentication modernization, and enhanced monitoring capabilities. Patricia was reviewing the remediation plan with obvious interest. Margaret, what kind of timeline are we looking at for this work? Full remediation would require approximately 18 months and significant coordination between legacy and modern system teams, Margaret replied. But we could implement critical security controls within the next 90 days. Alex was studying the remediation plan timeline. Margaret, what kind of resources would we need for this project? Margaret had calculated this answer precisely. A dedicated team of 6 security engineers with experience in both legacy and modern systems. I would recommend bringing in external consultants who specialize in hybrid infrastructure security. Brandon was looking at the technical specifications. In Margaret's plan. Margaret, this is incredibly detailed work. How long have you been developing this remediation strategy? 2 years, Margaret replied. I've been refining the plan each time I discover new vulnerabilities or attack vectors. Patricia closed the remediation plan and looked at Alex. We need to implement this immediately. Margaret has essentially been running a one-person security program for our most critical vulnerabilities. Alex nodded slowly. Margaret, I want you to lead the remediation project. We'll provide whatever resources you need. Thomas was still focused on the legal implications. Alex, we also need to consider our reporting obligations. If this was a state-sponsored attack, we may need to notify federal agencies. Margaret had been expecting this question. I've preserved all evidence from the attack, including network traffic captures and system logs. The forensic data would be sufficient for a federal investigation. Patricia was already thinking about next steps. Margaret, can you brief the FBI's cybercrime unit on the attack methodology? They need to understand how sophisticated adversaries are targeting corporate legacy systems. Margaret felt a familiar sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving government service. Absolutely. I can provide detailed technical briefings and share the attack signatures I've identified. Alex returned to his seat at the head of the table. Margaret, I want to be clear about something. Your actions this morning saved this company from a catastrophic security breach. You demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise and judgment that we need in our security leadership. Brandon was still processing the scope of Margaret's expertise. Margaret, I think I owe you an apology as well. I clearly didn't understand the value of your analysis. Margaret nodded politely, but her focus was already shifting to the work ahead. She had spent months trying to get people to listen to her warnings. Now finally, she had their attention and the resources to address the vulnerabilities she had been documenting. Alex, there's one more thing you need to understand, Margaret said. This attack was likely a probing operation. The adversaries now know that we detected their activities and improved our security posture. They'll adapt their methods and try again. Patricia was already thinking about threat intelligence and ongoing monitoring. Margaret, what kind of ongoing security measures do we need to implement? Margaret opened her portfolio to the final section of her plan. We need to establish continuous monitoring for all legacy systems, implement threat hunting capabilities, and develop intelligence sharing relationships with other organizations that face similar threats. Alex was studying the scope of Margaret's recommendations. Margaret, it sounds like you're describing a completely new approach to corporate security. That's exactly what I'm describing, Margaret replied. The threat landscape has evolved, but our security strategies are still based on assumptions that were valid 20 years ago. We need to acknowledge that sophisticated adversaries understand our infrastructure better than we do. Thomas was reviewing his notes one final time. Alex, I think our immediate priority is implementing Margaret's remediation plan and notifying our legal and regulatory contacts about the breach. Patricia was already planning the security program restructuring that would be necessary. "Margaret, how quickly can you put together a team to begin the remediation work?" Margaret had been preparing for this opportunity for months. "I can have a preliminary team structure and project timeline ready by this afternoon." Alex stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Margaret, you have my full authorization to proceed with the remediation project. Whatever resources you need, whatever authority you require, you have it." As the other executives gathered their materials and left the conference room, Patricia remained behind to speak with Margaret privately. "Margaret, I want you to know that I understand what you accomplished this morning. In my experience, the people who prevent disasters rarely get the recognition they deserve." Margaret packed her portfolio, feeling a sense of validation that she hadn't experienced in years. "Patricia, I've been preparing for this kind of threat my entire career. I'm just glad I was finally in a position to do something about it." Patricia smiled. "Margaret, you weren't just in position. You created the position. Your monitoring systems, your vulnerability analysis, your remediation planning. You built a security program that nobody else knew existed." As Margaret left the conference room, she realized that everything had changed in the span of a single morning. She was no longer the outdated legacy systems administrator who was tolerated but not valued. She was now the security expert who had prevented a catastrophic breach and would lead the company's most critical security initiative. The recognition felt good, but Margaret knew that the real work was just beginning. The adversaries who had attacked DataCore were still out there, and they would be back with new methods and greater determination. Margaret was ready for them. 2 years after the initial DataCore breach, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at Carnegie Mellon University, delivering the closing keynote at the International Conference on Critical Infrastructure Protection. The audience included cybersecurity researchers, government officials, and industry leaders from 43 countries, all gathered to discuss the evolving landscape of sophisticated cyber threats. "When I first detected signs of systematic reconnaissance against DataCore's legacy systems," Margaret began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from being recognized as one of the world's leading experts on hybrid infrastructure security. "I couldn't have imagined that those attacks would reveal a fundamental blind spot in how we approach cybersecurity as a global community." The presentation slides behind her showed a world map dotted with red indicators representing successful defenses against state-sponsored attacks using her methodology. Each dot represented an organization that had implemented the Chun framework, as her security approach had become known in academic and professional circles. "The adversaries we face today understand something that many defenders have forgotten. Modern security is only as strong as its weakest legacy component. They've built their strategies around exploiting the trust relationships between old and new systems, betting that our focus on cutting-edge threats would blind us to foundational vulnerabilities." Dr. Michael Foster from NSA's Advanced Threat Research Division, who had become a close collaborator since their first meeting, watched from the front row with obvious pride. The public-private partnership that had emerged from Margaret's initial federal briefings had evolved into a comprehensive threat intelligence sharing program that now included over 200 organizations across critical infrastructure sectors. Margaret clicked to her next slide, which showed attack timeline comparisons between organizations using traditional security approaches and those implementing her methodology. The data is clear. Organizations that address legacy infrastructure vulnerabilities proactively can reduce successful breach attempts by 73% and decrease incident response times by 89%. In the audience, Alex Morrison, DataCore's CEO, smiled as he watched his former outdated employee command the attention of world-class cybersecurity experts. DataCore had transformed from a technology company with adequate security into a cybersecurity powerhouse. generating over $200 million annually from security consulting and methodology licensing. But more importantly, the company had become a model for how organizations could build security programs that match the sophistication of modern threats. The technical solutions are important, but they're not the most critical component of effective cybersecurity, Margaret continued. The real breakthrough comes when organizations learn to value expertise wherever they find it, regardless of how it's packaged or presented. Margaret's team, now a 50-person division within DataCore, had become a destination for cybersecurity professionals who wanted to work on the most challenging problems in the field. Sarah Kim, her former FBI colleague, served as deputy director and had built international partnerships with law enforcement agencies that were tracking similar threat groups. David Park led the threat intelligence division and coordinated with academic researchers who were studying the evolution of state-sponsored cyber operations. We've learned that the most dangerous assumption in cybersecurity is the belief that new threats require entirely new solutions, Margaret explained to the audience. Sometimes the most effective defenses come from understanding how old vulnerabilities create new opportunities for sophisticated adversaries. Brandon Walsh, who had become Margaret's closest corporate ally and now served as DataCore's chief technology officer, was coordinating the live stream of Margaret's presentation to cybersecurity teams around the world. The transformation of their professional relationship had become a case study in how organizational dynamics could evolve when expertise was properly recognized and valued. The Chen framework isn't just a set of technical controls, Brandon had explained in a recent industry interview. It's a methodology for thinking about security challenges that don't fit into conventional categories. Margaret taught us that effective cybersecurity requires understanding both the history of how systems were built and the evolution of how attackers think. In the university auditorium, Margaret was addressing questions from the international audience. A cybersecurity director from a European energy company asked about the scalability challenges of implementing comprehensive legacy system protection. The key insight is that legacy infrastructure security can't be solved by individual organizations working in isolation. Margaret replied, "We need coordinated defense networks that allow real-time threat intelligence sharing and collaborative incident response." Dr. Jennifer Liu from Stanford, who had completed her research on Margaret's organizational transformation, stood to ask a question that went to the heart of the broader implications of her work. Ms. Chen, your success has influenced how organizations think about expertise and professional development in cybersecurity. What advice would you give to other professionals who feel their knowledge isn't being properly valued? Margaret paused, thinking about her own journey from dismissed legacy systems administrator to internationally recognized expert. First, never stop preparing, even when others can't see the value of what you're doing. The moment when your expertise becomes critical often arrives without warning, and you need to be ready. She clicked a slide showing photographs of her current team, a diverse group of cybersecurity professionals who had joined DataCore, specifically to work on advanced threat detection and response. Second, when you do get the opportunity to demonstrate your expertise, use it to create opportunities for others who might be overlooked. The most lasting impact comes from building systems and cultures that recognize expertise, regardless of its source. A government cybersecurity official from Japan asked about the evolution of the threats that Margaret's team was tracking. Ms. Chen, how have the adversaries adapted to the widespread adoption of your defensive methodology? Margaret smiled, knowing that this question addressed one of the most important aspects of her work. The adversaries have definitely evolved their techniques, but they've also been forced to abandon some of their most effective attack vectors. More importantly, the intelligence sharing networks we've built allow us to track their adaptations and develop countermeasures much more quickly than they can implement new attack methods. Agent Lisa Rodriguez from the FBI's Cyber Division, who had maintained a close working relationship with Margaret's team, was participating in the conference via secure video link. Ms. Chun, from a law enforcement perspective, the intelligence that your methodology generates has been invaluable for tracking and prosecuting cyber criminals. Can you discuss how private sector threat detection contributes to broader national security objectives? Margaret was pleased by the opportunity to address this intersection between corporate and national security. The traditional model treated corporate cybersecurity and national security as separate domains, but sophisticated adversaries don't respect those boundaries. When private sector organizations develop advanced threat detection capabilities, they become force multipliers for our national cybersecurity efforts. After the formal presentation, Margaret participated in a panel discussion with other leading cybersecurity experts about the future of critical infrastructure protection. The conversation reinforced her belief that the field was finally beginning to understand the importance of addressing legacy vulnerabilities and building coordinated defense networks. Dr. Patricia Valdez, who had left DataCorps to become the Director of Cybersecurity for the Department of Energy, joined the panel remotely to discuss how government agencies were implementing lessons learned from Margaret's work. The Chun framework has become a cornerstone of federal cybersecurity guidance because it addresses the reality of how critical infrastructure actually operates, not just how we wish it operated. During the lunch break, Margaret was approached by dozens of conference attendees who wanted to discuss specific implementation challenges and threat intelligence sharing opportunities. She found herself in the position of being a mentor and advisor to cybersecurity professionals around the world who were dealing with similar challenges in their own organizations. A young security analyst from a healthcare system in Canada spoke with Margaret about the difficulties of getting executive support for legacy infrastructure protection. Ms. Chun, how do you convince senior leaders to invest in security for systems they don't understand and threats they can't see? Margaret recognized the frustration in the young woman's voice, remembering her own struggles to get DataCorps' leadership to take her warnings seriously. The key is connecting technical vulnerabilities to business consequences that executives can understand. Show them what happens when sophisticated attackers gain access to legacy systems that support critical operations. An experienced security architect from a financial services company asked about career development in an industry that often prioritized youth over expertise. Ms. Chun, how do we build cybersecurity teams that value experience and institutional knowledge? Margaret had given considerable thought to this question as she built her own team. We need to change how we measure cybersecurity expertise. Technical certifications and academic credentials are important, but they're not the only indicators of valuable knowledge. Sometimes the most critical expertise comes from people who've been dismissed as outdated or obsolete. That evening, Margaret attended a reception hosted by Carnegie Mellon's Cybersecurity Research Center, where she was surrounded by graduate students and faculty members who were studying the evolving landscape of cyber threats. She found herself energized by their enthusiasm and their willingness to challenge conventional assumptions about cybersecurity. Professor David Kim, who directed the university's Critical Infrastructure Research Program, introduced Margaret to PO, a group of doctoral students who were working on next-generation threat detection systems. Ms. Chun's work represents exactly the kind of practical expertise that academic research needs to address real-world cybersecurity challenges. One of the doctoral students, a former government analyst named Maria Santos, asked Margaret about the intersection between academic research and operational security. Ms. Chun, how can university researchers contribute to the kind of threat intelligence networks you've built? Margaret was excited by the opportunity to bridge academic and operational cybersecurity. Academic researchers have the freedom to pursue long-term questions that operational teams can't address. You can study the fundamental patterns in adversary behavior and develop theoretical frameworks that help us understand how threats will evolve. Later that evening, Margaret video called her team back at Datacorp's operations center, where they were monitoring threats and coordinating responses across their global client network. The overnight shift included security analysts from 6 different countries, reflecting the international scope that her program had achieved. "Margaret, we're seeing interesting developments in the threat landscape," reported Dr. James Chun, who now served as Datacorp's Director of Threat Research. "The adversary groups we've been tracking appear to be consolidating their operations and focusing on targets that haven't implemented advanced legacy protection." Margaret wasn't surprised by this development. "James, that's exactly what we expected. As more organizations implement comprehensive security controls, the adversaries will focus their efforts on the remaining vulnerable targets." Sarah Kim joined the video call from the FBI's Cyber Operations Center, where she was coordinating a multi-agency response to a sophisticated attack against power grid infrastructure. "Margaret, the attack we're currently investigating is using techniques that are almost identical to what we saw at Datacorp 2 years ago. The adversaries haven't given up. They've just shifted to targets that aren't prepared for this level of threat." Margaret felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Her methodology was protecting the organizations that had implemented it, but there were still thousands of potential targets that remained vulnerable to the same threats that had once threatened Datacorp. "Sarah, this reinforces why the intelligence sharing networks are so critical," Margaret replied. "We need to accelerate the adoption of comprehensive legacy protection across all critical infrastructure sectors." As Margaret returned to her hotel room, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years ago, she had been a dismissed legacy systems administrator whose warnings about sophisticated threats were ignored by her own colleagues. Tonight, she was recognized as one of the world's leading experts on a category of cyber threats that governments and corporations were racing to address. But the personal recognition, while gratifying, was less important than the structural changes that her work had created. Organizations around the world were beginning to understand that cybersecurity required more than just modern tools and young talent. They were learning to value expertise wherever they found it and to build security programs that addressed the full complexity of hybrid infrastructure environments. Margaret's phone buzzed with a secure message from NSA's Threat Operations Center. "Ms. Chun, we're tracking coordinated reconnaissance against 3 critical infrastructure targets. The attack patterns match signatures from your threat intelligence database. Can your team provide technical support for the federal response?" Margaret smiled as she typed her response. "Team is standing by. We'll have technical analysts ready to deploy within 1 hour." As she prepared for another night of coordinating responses to sophisticated cyber threats, Margaret thought about the promise she had made to her brother Ben all those years ago. She had kept that promise in ways that neither of them could have imagined, building a career that honored his memory while protecting critical infrastructure from threats that most people couldn't even see. Margaret opened her laptop and connected to Datacorp's Global Threat Monitoring Network, where her team was coordinating with partners around the world to track and counter sophisticated adversaries. The work was challenging and never-ending, but it was also exactly what she had prepared for her entire career. Outside her hotel window, the lights of Pittsburgh twinkled in the darkness, a reminder of the critical infrastructure that her work was helping to protect. Power grids, financial networks, healthcare systems, and transportation infrastructure. All of them dependent on the kind of legacy systems that most cybersecurity professionals still didn't fully understand. Margaret's approach had proven that these systems could be defended, but only by professionals who understood both their historical development and their current vulnerabilities. The expertise that had once been dismissed as outdated was now recognized as critical knowledge for protecting national security. The threat landscape would continue to evolve, and new adversaries would develop new attack techniques. But Margaret had built a framework for understanding and countering these threats that could adapt and grow with the changing environment. More importantly, she had proven that expertise and dedication could overcome any form of institutional blindness or professional dismissal. Margaret looked at the framed photograph on her desk, the one that showed her brother Ben beside his Black Hawk helicopter. She had found her own way to honor his example of being ready when others needed her most. The recognition felt good, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that her work was making the world more secure. She had been dismissed as outdated at 45, but she had proven that some forms of expertise only became more valuable with time. Margaret closed her laptop and prepared for the challenges that tomorrow would bring. Somewhere in the digital infrastructure that connected the modern world, sophisticated adversaries were planning their next moves. But they would find defenders who were ready for them, professionals who understood that the most important battles were often fought by people who others had forgotten were even there. The quiet revolution that Margaret had started was no longer quiet, and it was no longer just hers. It belonged to every cybersecurity professional who had been overlooked because they didn't fit conventional expectations, every expert whose knowledge had been dismissed because it seemed outdated, and every defender who understood that protecting critical infrastructure required more than just modern tools and young energy. Margaret had proven that when the moment came, experience and preparation could accomplish what credentials and conformity could not. She had been ready when others couldn't see the threat, and she had built a legacy that would continue protecting critical infrastructure long after she had moved on to new challenges. The transformation was complete, but the mission would never end. And that was exactly how Margaret wanted it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.